August 12, 1972, Frank Sinatra's compound in Palm Springs. Bruce Lee raised his hand to strike Frank Sinatra, and Dean Martin stopped it without saying a word. The party had been running for 2 hours. 80 guests. Pool lights reflecting off the water. Desert air warm and dry. Music playing somewhere behind the main house. Frank's 57th birthday. The kind of gathering that only Frank could assemble. Producers, singers, the people who ran Hollywood in 1972. And standing near the bar, 32 years old, at the absolute peak of his physical power, Bruce Lee. He had arrived with the director Robert Clouse. He had been relaxed at first, telling stories, making people laugh, demonstrating small techniques for curious guests. But something had shifted in the last hour. The drinks, the dismissive comments from producers who saw him as a novelty, the casual condescension of men who did not fully understand who they were talking to. And then Frank had called him kid for the second time. And Bruce Lee's right hand had come up fast, fist chambered at shoulder level, classic 1-inch punch position, 1 second from impact. Frank's face registered what was happening too late. He had half a step back and nowhere to go. 80 guests froze where they stood. Sammy Davis Jr. started moving from across the patio. Too slow. Nobody was close enough. Nobody except Don Martin, who had been watching Bruce Lee all evening, who had already positioned himself exactly where he needed to be, who crossed 5 feet of patio in one fluid step and placed himself between Bruce Lee and Frank Sinatra with complete and absolute calm. Nobody knew if Bruce would actually strike. Nobody knew if Dean could stop the world's most dangerous man without throwing a punch. Nobody knew what would happen in the next 3 seconds. But Dean Martin had already decided what he was going to do. By August of 1972, Bruce Lee was one of the most physically capable human beings alive. Enter the Dragon had just finished filming but had not yet been released. Return of the Dragon was already a massive success in Hong Kong. Hollywood was beginning to understand that something extraordinary was happening. Bruce was 32 years old and in the peak condition of his life. He trained every day with an intensity that most professional athletes could not match. He had developed a philosophy of combat he called Jeet Kune Do. It was not a traditional martial art with fixed forms and rigid structure. It was a living approach to fighting that drew from everything that worked and discarded everything that did not. Bruce could move with a speed that cameras struggled to capture. He could generate force from almost any position at almost any distance. People who trained with him described the experience as trying to stop weather. He was also a man who had spent years fighting for respect in a Hollywood system that marginalized Asian performers systematically and casually. He had been passed over for roles designed for him. He had watched less talented performers get opportunities simply because of how they looked. He carried the frustration of that with a dignity that rarely cracked. But on the nights when he drank, which was not often, the control could slip. The patience that served him so well in the daylight hours became thinner. The grievances that he normally processed quietly began to surface. And at Frank Sinatra's birthday party on August 12, 1972, every one of those conditions was present at the same time. Frank Sinatra in 1972 was 57 years old and arguably the most powerful figure in American entertainment. He had briefly retired from performing in 1971. The retirement did not take, as most people who knew Frank had predicted. But even in this in-between period, he remained the central gravitational force of his social world. His Palm Springs compound was his kingdom. The guest list for his birthday party represented the inner circle of Hollywood power. Everyone in that room understood the unspoken rules. Frank was the host. Frank was the chairman of the board. Challenges to his authority in his own home did not happen. They simply were not part of the social grammar of a rat-pack gathering. Dean Martin had been Frank's closest friend for 25 years by that evening. Their friendship had been tested by the usual pressures of two large personalities operating in close proximity for decades. But it had held. Dean was not Frank's bodyguard or his enforcer. He was something more specific than either of those things. He was the person Frank trusted completely in every situation without qualification. And Dean had been at enough of Frank's gatherings to understand when a situation was developing in a direction that required his attention. He had positioned himself near Bruce Lee earlier in the evening not because he was looking for trouble, but because he had seen the signs of trouble building and had decided quietly and without announcement that he was going to be close enough to address it if it arrived. The party had begun at 8 o'clock in the evening. Dean arrived early, which he always did for Frank's events. The compound looked beautiful in the August desert evening. The pool area had been set up for the occasion. Flowers, lights, the smell of food coming from somewhere inside. Sammy Davis Jr. was already there when Dean arrived, which was also usual. The two of them stood together for a while near the far end of the pool, catching up in the way old friends do when they have been busy and have not seen each other recently. Bruce Lee arrived at 8 with Robert Clouse. Dean noticed him immediately when he walked through the gate. Not because Bruce was famous, though he was. Because Bruce moved differently than other people. There was a quality to his physical presence that registered before anything else. A coiled readiness that never fully left him even in social settings. He was dressed more casually than most of the other guests. He stood slightly apart at first, taking in the room with eyes that missed nothing. Frank greeted him warmly. Den watched from across the patio and formed his first impression impressive, intense, worth watching. The first hour was uneventful. Bruce was charming and engaged. He told stories about the Hong Kong film industry that held the attention of everyone around him. He demonstrated a few basic techniques when guests expressed curiosity, and the demonstrations were elegant and controlled. Dean noticed that Bruce was drinking scotch. Not what he would have expected. Also not something that worried him yet, but something to file away. Around 9 in the evening, Dean said something quiet to Sammy. He said Bruce was wound pretty tight. Sammy said to give him time. But Dean was already paying closer attention. Nobody knew Dean was already preparing to intervene if the evening required it. Bruce Lee was at the peak of his physical power in 1972. The world would soon know him as the greatest martial artist who ever lived. But on August 12th in Palm Springs, he was a guest at Frank Sinatra's party. And he was about to cross a line that nobody crossed. Nobody knew Dean Martin was watching everything from the moment Bruce arrived. We are trying to reach 700 subscribers to keep these stories alive. We are at 300 right now. If stories like this matter to you, the moments when real power revealed itself, the quiet courage that stopped violence before it started, subscribe now. There is an entire Don Martin playlist waiting. What happened in the next hour would test friendship, loyalty, and the meaning of real strength. At around 9:30 in the evening, the energy in Bruce Lee's corner of the patio began to change in ways that Dean could read from 15 feet away. Bruce had joined a conversation with a group of producers near the bar. The subject was the state of Asian representation in Hollywood. It was a subject Bruce cared about with the full weight of personal experience. He had been on the receiving end of Hollywood's systematic marginalization for years. He was making valid points with increasing force. The producers he was talking to were backing away verbally without acknowledging that he was right. One of them made the mistake of telling Bruce he was being too sensitive. The words landed on Bruce's face like a physical thing. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. The casual ease of the first hour was completely gone. Frank walked over at this point, exercising his host's instinct to smooth over emerging friction. He told Bruce that Enter the Dragon was going to be huge. He meant it as a genuine compliment. Bruce heard the word kid and something behind his eyes shifted. He told Frank quietly, but with an unmistakable edge, that he was not a kid. Frank, who was genuinely not trying to condescend, said it was a figure of speech. Bruce said no offense taken. But his body language was saying something entirely different. Shoulders tight, jaw set, hands beginning to open and close at his sides in the unconscious way that fighters' hands move when adrenaline is building. Dean, now 20 feet away and watching everything, recognized what he was seeing. He started moving, not quickly, not with any obvious purpose, just positioning, closing the distance between himself and the two men in a way that appeared casual to everyone watching. He was within arm's reach of both of them within 90 seconds. Nobody knew Dean had already calculated the angles and the distances he would need. At 10 o'clock, Frank made a joke about Bruce teaching him some moves for his next film. He meant it as friendly warmth. Bruce heard mockery in it. He asked Frank directly if he thought martial arts was a joke. Frank said no. He was saying Bruce was talented. The conversation escalated in the rapid way that confrontations escalate when pride and alcohol are both present. Bruce stood up fully from where he had been partially seated on the edge of a patio chair. His energy coiled into something that the guests nearest to him could feel as a physical pressure. He said he could show Frank what real power looked like. The guests in the immediate area began stepping back. A circle formed without anyone consciously deciding to form one. The music stopped somewhere in the background. Whether someone turned it off or it simply ended at that moment, nobody was certain afterward. Frank, whose instinct was never to back down from a challenge in his own home, told Bruce he had had enough to drink. There was the word again. Kid. Bruce's eyes locked onto Frank with a focus that was qualitatively different from anything earlier in the evening. He said he had had enough of a lot of things. The challenge that followed was blunt. Bruce asked Frank what he thought he had that was real. Money and connections, he said. Bruce said he had real power. Physical power. Frank's face reddened. He told Bruce to watch how he spoke in his home. Bruce said, "Or what?" and the two words changed the temperature of the entire party. Frank stepped forward. Automatic. Bruce's weight shifted into the fighting stance that his body adopted without conscious decision. His right hand began rising. Dean was 5 feet away. He had been 5 feet away for 10 minutes. Nobody knew Dean had already decided exactly what he would do if Bruce moved. The 80 guests on that patio were frozen in the way that people freeze when violence becomes suddenly real rather than theoretical. These were not people who lived near violence. They were actors and producers and musicians, people whose world ran on negotiation and reputation and carefully maintained relationships. Physical confrontation was not part of the grammar of their lives. What they were watching was outside the range of what they had prepared themselves to respond to. Several of them described the same instinct afterward. The instinct to look away, to pretend they were not seeing what they were seeing, to allow the moment to resolve itself without their involvement. Only Sammy Davis Jr. was moving. He had started across the patio from 30 feet away when Bruce's hand first began rising. He was not going to get there in time. He knew he was not going to get there in time. He kept moving anyway because standing still was not something his body would allow. Dean was the only person close enough to matter. And Dean had been close enough for 10 minutes because Dean had put himself there. Nobody knew in those frozen seconds whether they were about to watch something irreversible happen. Nobody knew if Dean's intervention would make things better or trigger the violence it was trying to prevent. Nobody knew if the most dangerous martial artist in the world would stop when a singer from Ohio asked him to. Bruce Lee's fist was cocked. Frank Sinatra was 1 second away from being struck by the most dangerous martial artist in the world. 80 people watched in horror and could not move. Dean Martin was 5 feet away and completely calm. What Dean did in the next 3 seconds stopped the strike without violence. It changed how Bruce Lee understood power. It proved that real strength has nothing to do with fighting. If you want to know exactly what Dean Martin did, how he stopped Bruce Lee without throwing a punch, why Bruce apologized and left within 20 minutes, the moment is here right now. Dean moved in one fluid step, not running, not lunging, walking pace, but covering 5 feet in a single stride. He placed himself between Bruce and Frank with his back to Frank and his eyes on Bruce. His left hand came up not as a strike and not as a defensive guard, but as an interception. He caught Bruce's raised wrist in a grip that was firm enough to stop the motion and gentle enough to communicate that it was not a challenge. Bruce's fist froze mid-chamber. The surprise in Bruce's eyes was genuine. He had not seen Dean moving, had not registered the approach until the hand was already there. Den's face in that moment was described by every witness who later gave an account in the same terms. Completely calm. No anger. No fear. Eyes locked on Bruce's eyes with the expression of someone who has seen this kind of moment before and has already decided how it ends. Dean spoke one word. He said Bruce's name. Quietly. Not a command. Just an acknowledgement. Bruce's body unlocked slightly in response to the sound of it. Dean said 3 more words. Not here. Not tonight. Then he said not him. Nothing in Den's voice made it a threat. Nothing made it a plea. It was simply a statement of what was going to happen. Bruce stood there with his fist in Dean's gentle grip and made the calculation that every fighter makes when confronted with someone who refuses to be rattled. He could break the grip easily. He had the physical ability to do whatever he chose. But something in Dean's steadiness gave him pause. Dean was not challenging him to escalate. Dean was not backing away from him. Dean was simply present, immovable without aggression, calm without weakness. Bruce's fist unclenched slowly. Dean felt it through the contact at his wrist. His own grip softened in response. Bruce's hand lowered. Den's hand guided it the last few inches down with a touch so light it barely registered. Then he released the wrist entirely and stood still. He did not step back. He did not turn around. He remained between the 2 men with his eyes still on Bruce and his hands now open and at his sides. Bruce offered the face-saving explanation. He said he was just demonstrating. Dean said he knew. Then he said the demonstration was over now. Not a command, an observation about reality. Bruce took 1 step back and then another. Dean did not move forward, just held the space. Bruce looked past Dean to Frank and offered a formal apology. Frank accepted it. Bruce told Robert Clouse they should go. They left within 20 minutes of the intervention. Bruce walked out with his dignity intact because Dean had given him a way out that did not require anyone to be humiliated. Nobody knew Dean's heart was pounding in his chest the entire time. Nobody knew he had been genuinely uncertain whether Bruce would choose to push through. Nobody knew Dean had been prepared to take the punch himself if it came to that. After Bruce left, the party continued. Someone turned the music back on. Conversations resumed in the cautious way that conversations resume after something large has almost happened. Dean walked to the bar and poured himself a drink. His hand was completely steady. Sammy appeared beside him within 30 seconds. He started to say something, and Dean stopped him with a small shake of his head. Sammy stood there for a moment and then nodded and did not say the thing he had been about to say. Dean finished his drink and started telling jokes within half an hour. Not about what had happened, about something else entirely. Whatever the opposite of dwelling was, that was what Dean was doing. Guests who had been watching him with new eyes began to relax back into the normal rhythms of the evening. Frank found Dean alone near the edge of the pool later in the evening. He said Dean had saved his face. Dean said face, actually, and smiled slightly. Frank laughed and the tension in his shoulders released. Frank asked if Dean had been worried that Bruce would actually go through with it. Dean said for about 3 seconds, yeah. Frank asked what Dean would have done if Bruce had pushed past him. Dean said he would have taken the punch. Frank stared at him for a long moment. He said that Dean would have let Bruce hit him instead of Frank. Dean shrugged and said that was what friends did. Frank's eyes became wet. He started to say something else and Dean told him to drop it. It was over. Nobody knew Frank was seeing his friend in an entirely different light from that moment forward. Nobody knew Frank would tell the story of that night for the rest of his life to people he trusted. The following afternoon, Bruce Lee called Dean Martin. Den answered and asked how Bruce was feeling with no anger in his voice, just genuine inquiry. Bruce was thrown off by the warmth. He had prepared a formal apology, and the warmth made it harder to deliver, not easier. He gave the apology anyway. He said his behavior had been inexcusable. He said he had disrespected Frank in Frank's own home and had put Dean in a position no one should be put in. Den told him everyone had bad nights. Bruce said not him. Not like that. He said he prided himself on control. Dean said pride trips everyone up eventually. They talked for 20 minutes. Bruce asked Dean if he had known Bruce would stop. Dean said he had not known for sure. He said he had just known he had to try. Bruce asked if Dean had been afraid. Dean said of course he had been afraid. He said Bruce was Bruce Lee. The honesty of that answer disarmed Bruce completely. He asked why Dean had stepped in front of him anyway. Dean said Frank was his friend and Bruce had been Frank's guest. He said both of those things had mattered more than his fear. There was a long silence on the line. Bruce said he had fought many men but had never met anyone with Dean's kind of courage. Den told him to call him Dean and thanked him. Then he said what Bruce did took real courage. He said he had just had to stand still for 3 seconds. They never became close friends, but the respect between them was genuine and mutual from that conversation forward. Nobody knew this phone call would be referenced by Bruce Lee in interviews for the rest of his life. Nobody knew that a 20-minute conversation the morning after would mean more to Bruce than almost any match or competition that had preceded it. The witnesses who spoke about that night over the following decades gave accounts that were consistent in every essential detail. Sammy Davis Jr. said in a 1985 interview that he had been at Frank's party the night Bruce Lee almost hit him and that Dean Martin had stopped it. He said people always asked how Dean did it. He said he told them Dean had not done anything except be Dean. That was enough. Robert Clouse said in interviews in the 1990s that Bruce had talked about that night for years. He said Bruce was embarrassed about losing control but had been genuinely impressed by Dean's handling of the situation. He said Bruce told him Dean had shown him a different kind of martial art, the art of diffusing without fighting. An anonymous guest who had been standing about 10 feet from the confrontation gave an account in 2002. He said he had seen Bruce's fist come up and had seen Frank's face go white. Then Dean was just there, he said. He said Dean had not run or tackled Bruce, just intercepted the motion like he had all the time in the world. He said Bruce could have pushed through easily. Something in Den's eyes had made him reconsider everything. A staff member who had been serving drinks that night spoke in 2010. She said she had dropped her tray when Bruce raised his hand because she thought she was about to witness something terrible. She said Dean had appeared so fast but so completely calm that it seemed like he had been expecting the moment. She said after it was over, Dean had asked if she was okay and helped her pick up the broken glasses from her dropped tray. She said that was who he was. He had stopped a potential disaster and then helped clean up broken glass. Nobody knew these accounts would become the primary record of what happened that August night. Nobody knew the witnesses standing on that patio had been watching something that would be discussed for decades afterward. Nobody knew Dean himself would never add a single word to the public record because in Dean's understanding, nothing worth recording had happened. A problem had developed. He had been in the right place. It had resolved. That was all there was to say about it. Nobody knew for certain what Dean Martin had been feeling in those 3 seconds between stepping in front of Bruce Lee and Bruce lowering his hand. Nobody knew how many times Dean had replayed that evening in the months and years after. Nobody knew whether he had guessed himself or whether the decision had felt as clean and obvious in memory as it looked from the outside. What was known was simpler than any of those questions. Frank Sinatra was his friend. Frank had needed him in a specific moment. Dean had been there. That was the entire story as Dean understood it. The analysis that other people applied to his actions. The words like courage and heroism and de-escalation, those were other people's words. Dean would not have used any of them about himself. He had seen a problem developing and had put himself where the problem was. When the moment came, he had been in the right place. He had said the right words. Bruce had made the right choice. Everything else was just the way things were. August 12, 1972. Bruce Lee raised his hand to strike Frank Sinatra. Dean Martin stepped between them. No punches thrown, no tackles, no yelling, no violence. Just presence, calm, and absolute certainty. Bruce Lee lowered his hand and apologized. Frank Sinatra saw his friend in a new light. And Dean Martin went back to his drink like nothing had happened. If you want more stories about Dean Martin, the moments that revealed his character, the quiet heroism that never made headlines, the man behind the legend, there is an entire playlist waiting. We are at 300 subscribers and working towards 700. Keep making these. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. What Dean Martin did on August 12, 1972 looks simple on the surface. He stepped between two men. He caught a raised wrist. He spoke softly. But beneath that simplicity was a lifetime of reading people and situations before they became crises. Dean had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, where physical confrontation was not abstract. He had worked nightclubs where the men who decided whether you worked were not always gentle. He had navigated 30 years of Hollywood egos and rack-pack dynamics and Las Vegas politics. All of that had taught him something that Bruce Lee, for all his extraordinary martial arts mastery, was still learning in 1972. The best fight is the one that never happens. Dean did not stop Bruce through superior physical technique. He stopped him through positioning and awareness and presence. He had been watching Bruce all evening. He had seen the energy building before it became dangerous. He had placed himself close enough to act before the action was required. When the moment came, he was already there. No dramatic entrance. Just a step that had been prepared for 30 minutes. When he caught Bruce's raised wrist, he did not challenge Bruce to escalate. He gave Bruce a dignified exit, a way to step back without being humiliated in front of 80 witnesses. Bruce took it, not because he feared Dean physically, but because Dean had offered respect even while saying no. That was the practice Dean Martin had mastered over decades of public life. Not the practice of diffusing with words or techniques or strategy. The practice of being genuinely present and genuinely calm in the moments when presence and calm are the only things that matter. Bruce Lee spent his life studying how to end confrontations quickly and decisively. Dean Martin spent his life studying how to prevent them from becoming confrontations in the first place. Both are skills, both have value. But on August 12, 1972, Dean's approach was the one that meant nobody got hurt. Frank did not get hit. Bruce did not become the man who punched Frank Sinatra at his own birthday party. Dean did not have to hurt anyone he did not want to hurt. Dean Martin was not a man who talked about himself in heroic terms. He did not give speeches about loyalty or courage or the obligations of friendship. He expressed those things through action and then acted as though the action required no comment. This quality made him easy to underestimate. It also made him the person that people in real trouble consistently turned to. Frank had turned to him hundreds of times across 25 years for things large and small. Dean had never kept score. Never reminded Frank of the times he had shown up when it mattered. Never used the accumulated weight of his loyalty as leverage. He simply showed up again each time the situation called for it. August 12, 1972 was one of those times. The stakes were different from a late-night phone call or a professional disagreement that needed a calm voice. The stakes were physical and immediate. Dean's response was the same as always. He went where he needed to be. He did what the moment required. He said as little as possible, and then he poured himself a drink and let the evening continue.